Hello, hello. Welcome back to our free CCNA series for 2025. So, for today's topic, we're going to discuss NAT or Network Address Translation. Why did we have technology such as this? So, if you guys remember during our previous lesson or lecture during IPv4 and IPv6, the main reason why we are using IPv6 is because we're running out of IPv4 public addresses, right? So before this thing happen, like before we start utilizing IPv6, there's this technology called NAT, which is this one, or also called as Network Address Translation. And what it does is you have your private IP, and then that private IP will be converted into public IP so that it can access the internet. So before NAT is introduced, it's expected that every time that you need to access internet, you always have a public IP. But of course, the downside of that is it's hard for us to provide IP or public IP addresses for single devices, and this is also a way for like the engineers think of a way before to conserve IPv4 addresses, and during the time they think of a way to to conserve IP addresses, and that's why we're using or we are utilizing NAT or Network Address Translation, and that's also the reason why we have private IP. Because if you guys remember, during the IPv6 lecture, we mentioned that yes, we have IPv6 and we have private IPv6 and also public IPv6. But in reality, it's also we can also like remove the private IP of IPv6. But since we're so used to having like private and public IP addresses because of NAT, even using IPv6 right now, as you check or as you deep dive with IPv6, you'll notice that there's still private and also public IP addresses even for IPv6. But it's also good to know that main reason why we have this private and public and why we have NAT is because of the problem that we encounter before, that we're losing IP public or IP addresses really fast by having one devices that needs to connect to the internet, and then it needs to have its own IP addresses to be able to communicate. Okay, so for today we're going to talk about three basic type of NAT. So we have the static NAT. So if we're going to read the description of this one, as you can see, it's one-to-one mapping between a private IP and a public IP. So meaning we have a different pool of private IP. So we have class A, B, and C, and those, let's say we have a class C IP, and then this class C IP, we just have to map it on a public IP that most likely is it's provided by the provider or whoever your service provider. So we're talking about the enterprise setup, because if you're going to check at home, you always have your own public IP. Like for this one, you'll just ask, what's my IP? Or IP chicken. You can use different website to know your public IP, like this one. So IP chicken, so this would be my public IP, which is like provided by the ISP itself. This one, so 136. I'm not sure if I need to broadcast this one, but since this is a home setup, like it's this public IP might be changed from a different public IP because we don't have any configuration at all. And if you're going to check my Of course, I have my own private IP as well, but I'm not going to provide it here. But the thing is, all of our devices, in order for us to connect to the internet, we need to have at least a public IP to serve as the one who's going to communicate with the internet and then going to our own network or home network. And for our own network, we don't have any configuration on it since it's already been it's dynamic, like it the ISP will be the one who's going to provide us the public IP. So there's no configuration. But the idea is, as long as you are using or accessing the internet, there should always be public IP involved with that one. So I have my own private IP, which is this laptop that I'm using to provide lectures. And also I have public IP, which is given or dynamically provided by the ISP. Okay, so what we're going to do, what we're going to discuss is the setup in the enterprise level. So the one that you're going to see in the office. Because if you're working in an office or a corporate job, you cannot you cannot just have this public IP and you're all set. Why is that? First, if you're working in an office or enterprise, most of the time you will have your own server, or most of the time you will have your own network to communicate to a different office. So you cannot have a public IP that will change depending on the ISP. So you need to have a public IP that will be provided. So once you have your public IP that's provided by the ISP, so this will be the enterprise setup. They will give you a certain pool. Let's say they provided you /30. So you're going to use that IP. We're going to do the configuration on this as well on our part 2. But for now, they're going to provide you, like, let's say a /30 public IP. So that's where you're going to configure it on your own router or device. And you have to choose between these types. So we have static NAT. So as you can see, it's one-to-one mapping. And as you can see on this one, it's usually contains a web server. So why a web server for static NAT? Because if you're going to read the definition, it's a one-to-one mapping between a private IP address and a public IP. So meaning that specific server, you don't like to change its IP from time to time, right? So meaning we would like to have that public IP that's just for that specific server. So most of the time, this is used for a server itself, right? Because there will be many user who's going to access that server, and you don't like to change its public IP because first, there might be certain protocols that's only allowed for that specific IP, for that specific web server. So if there will be changes on that IP, you have to make a lot of changes, not just on the DNS, but also on the policies, securities that you applied going in and out to that specific address. So most of the time, it's a web server, or if it's a server, it could be a DNS server, it could be a web server, it could be an application used to run the website. We need to use the static NAT. Okay, and also we have the dynamic NAT. So for this one, it's many to many mapping. So almost the same with this, but you don't have a specific IP. So it's going to be, for this one, you have a specific private. So for this, it might be a pool of private IP and a pool of a public IP. And as you can see on the limitation, if the public IP pool runs out, the translation cannot happen. So meaning there will be given like a pool of public IP. So once that, let's say you have 5 pool for your office and you implement dynamic NAT. So for that, once we consume the first IP for the public, you're going to use the second until it goes to 0. And then if you have a certain device that will need to access the public and all of the public IP is already consumed or communicating to the internet, the tendency is whoever that user is or whoever that server is will not be able to access the internet. So this one, it's rarely that we're using dynamic NAT, but we're going to provide the configuration on this one on our part 2 series as well. So most of the configuration, we're going to do that on our next lecture. So last one, so we have discussed the static, also provided the dynamic NAT. The last one would be the path, or also known as a NAT overload. So this is the most common configuration because it doesn't require a lot of public IP, but it just work on by having ports on it. So for the ports, so these are um, ports is like just it's like a different path. Like for example, we have a specific port for SNMP. There are a specific port for Sedinas. Like if you're going to check that, port for SNMP would be like 161, 162. So that those are the default port. But we have port that are free to use. So in network, so there are a lot of port that we can use in order for us to uh, use that translation. So the idea is instead of having one private IP and one public IP, instead of doing that, we can have multiple private IP, and we're just going to use a different port for the private and the public so that we can have just a single public IP, and we're able to use or utilize that by different computers or machine inside your network. So that's also the reason why we have a lot of configuration, and we're still using this type of format for configuring our NAT in an enterprise setup. So those are the three things that we need to learn for us to understand what NAT is and the different purpose of those different NAT types. Okay, so for today's topic, it's more on lectures and theory first, and then next time on our part 2, like what we did on the IPv6, we're going to do the actual configuration of this topic. Okay, so again, thank you, and see you again next week.